Thank you. Thanks, Tim, and really thanks to Friedman and the AFE program in particular, which has provided. Well, I should thank them personally for providing me with so many great research assistants over so many years. But the program has arranged for the webcasting of this event, which we broadcast widely, so we may have people with us from all over the world. I hope it's a good evening in India. We also may be broadcasting on the Real News Network, an online news source. So this is all a great experiment in modern communications, and we'll see how it all goes. But I also wanted to thank our co-sponsors for the event, the Institute for Human Security at Fletcher. Academic Dean Fletcher Peter Uven had a conflict and couldn't be here, sends his regrets. But we thank his program for co-sponsoring with us. And then the Food Policy Club at the Fletcher School, which has co-sponsored this event, and with Elise Garvey, who is one of those remarkable research assistants from Friedman and Fletcher that I referred to earlier. I'm from the Global Development Environment Institute, which is sponsoring this event. We're jointly affiliated with the Fletcher School and the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. We're tucked down the hill in a nice little house on TL Avenue, if you haven't found us yet. GDAE has been around for almost 20 years and is dedicated to reforming economic theory, teaching, and practice. Practice in the form of economic policy, specifically related to international development and the environment. There's a literature table outside downstairs. You can get a lot of flyers about our publications. And please, there'll be a sign-up sheets that'll go around. Please sign up so we can tell you about future events. We have a brown bag lunch series. There's an event next Monday. And in the spring, we'll award our annual Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought, which is an annual event. We'll be giving it this year to development economists Francis Stewart and Albert Hirschman. We launched the prize actually in 2000 in this room with prizes for Amartya Sen and John Kenneth Galbraith. So it's always a great event. And I promised that I would mention the one other great food event going on today at Tufts. It's Food Day here, if you didn't know. Eric Schlosser of Fast Food Nation fame is speaking this evening at Adikman Arts Center. We were told there are still tickets. So if you go there, you might be able to get tickets. So at GDAE, my responsibility is reforming economic practice policies. I don't know how well I'm doing with that, looking at economic policies and practice out in the world today. But I'm the director of the Institute's Research and Policy Program and its 12-year project on globalization and sustainable development. And my main area of work in that is agriculture and rural development. And that's how I became familiar with the work of Olivier De Schutter. I wrote a report earlier this year with Sophia Murphy of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy on resolving the food crisis, assessing policy reform since 2007. And we did just that. Well, we did the assessing part. We actually haven't done so well on the resolving the food crisis part yet, but that's why we have Olivier here to help us out. But we concluded that the price spikes that we'd seen and that began in 2007 and 8 changed the international conversation about agriculture and rural development, but they have yet to change the actual drivers of those high prices and volatility. Those high prices and volatility are driven largely by biofuels expansion, financial speculation in food commodities, inadequate public stocks of key food crops, climate change, which hasn't been addressed either in mitigation or in adaptation, particularly for the most vulnerable communities, and the lack of investment in sustainable smallholder agriculture. The one assessment we found that was truly bright and shining in our overview was the Office of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food under Olivier De Schutter. He was appointed in 2008 with prices spiking. He wasted no time. immediately argued for a more far-reaching response to the crisis. And his small office has produced just an astonishing array of publications, briefing notes, policy interventions, while traveling the world and carrying out national assessments of the realization of the right to food. There may be one, indeed, in our very own United States. Stay tuned. But his office in that role has called for greater attention to agroecological practices, aggressive restrictions on commodity speculation, regulation of growing agribusiness concentration, urgent attention to climate change and bioenergy, restriction on land grabs, improved seed policies that support biodiversity, changes to multilateral trade rules, all with well-documented, incredibly well-researched reports. And that is really a partial list, and now, a year after we wrote the report, it's wildly out of date given how prolific his office is. It is really difficult to overstate the importance of the Special Rapporteur's voice in current policy debates. I saw him raise that voice in Rome at the Committee on World Food Security in October. He's taken on the G20. He was in Rio at the Summit on Sustainable Development, arguing for more sustainable policies, and he engages with national governments the world over. He will now raise that passionate voice for you here. So please, I ask that you silence your cell phones and give a very warm welcome to the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Olivier De Schutter.
Well, thank you, of course, Tim, for these overly generous comments. I have to say that my work would not be possible with that of the research community, and the work done by the GDAE Institute is, of course, one of my main sources of inspiration and reference on many issues, including speculation and biofuels in recent months. So thanks for all the very important work that you're doing, and thanks also to Tim Griffith for his introduction and for the work of the Friedman School of Nutrition. On the PowerPoint, I only mentioned the GDAE Institute. You'll excuse me for this, but it was indeed difficult for me to understand how these different bodies relate to one another. But I'm very grateful for being able to present you what the right to food has to bring to our discussions on global food security. Let me perhaps propose to begin with a very obvious remark, which is that the right to food is increasingly being referred to and increasingly used as a reference point in global discussions on food security in ways it had not been until the mid-1990s. The right to food is not a new thing. It's a human right that is inscribed in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. It is then a right that was stipulated in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1966. But for many years, it was not referred to. It was seen as abstract, as vague, as not operational, as not a tool, and at best, as a symbol. And this has changed. It has changed since the World Food Summit of 1996, when governments, for the first time, realized that improved accountability, participation, governance issues were key to the success of food security strategies. And they referred to the right to food in the declaration they adopted in the World Food Summit of 1996, asking essentially that the right to food be clarified in its normative implications so that governments may use it better as a tool to reduce hunger and malnutrition. The results of the World Food Summit of 1996 was that a number of initiatives were taken to provide the right to food with more content, make it more concrete, and essentially help governments understand how they could use it in a more effective way. One such initiative was by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the group of independent experts monitoring the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which adopted in 1999 a general comment, number 12, on the right to food, specifying what it meant, what the governments should do to comply with it, and explaining what its added value was in food security strategies. Another such initiative was developed between 2002 and 2004 within the FAO, which adopted in November 2004 a set of guidelines on the progressive realization of the right to food in the context of national food security. And this is a quite unique document because it was the first document negotiated by governments clarifying the content of an economic and social right. It actually had its source in the work of civil society organizations who developed a code of conduct on the right to food in 2002, and the governments wanted to build on these efforts to develop their guidelines, and there were 2 years of negotiations resulting in this very detailed set of recommendations, these voluntary guidelines on or in support of the progressive realization of the right to food, adopted unanimously by the FAO Council in 2004. And finally, and most recently, in the Rome Declaration adopted at the World Summit on Food Security in November 2009, the right to food is referred to in a very detailed and encouraging way as having to be part of the tools that we use and that we mobilize in order to fight global hunger. None of this would have been possible without the work not of a lawyer, but of an economist, who was the first economist to draw our attention in the early 1980s to the importance of institutions, accountability, democracy in achieving food security. And that economist was cited already by Tim Wise this afternoon. It is, of course, Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen, who in 1981 published his major book on the topic, Poverty and Famines, an essay on entitlement and deprivation, which was groundbreaking in that it identified institutions, accountability, participation, non-discrimination, and monitoring of governments as key to reduce the risks of hunger and malnutrition. In fact, Amartya Sen, for the first time, obliged us to revise our received understanding, our conventional wisdom, as John Kenneth Galbraith would say, about hunger, by saying it's not a matter of increasing production alone. It's not just a question of increasing food availability. It's not a technical question alone. It is a deeply political question because it requires us to address access to food for those who are marginalized, disempowered, and whose purchasing power is insufficient to procure food from the market. So Amartya Sen forced us to revise our lazy understanding of hunger as a technical issue. He obliged us to focus on the importance of holding governments accountable so that they do something when malnutrition, hunger, is threatening populations. And he obliged us to adopt the perspective of the poorest in understanding what hunger, malnutrition were about and which solutions were called for to remove the obstacles to access to food. So the thinking of Amartya Sen that essentially tried to complexify our understanding of hunger was instrumental, vital indeed, in leading governments to understand that they had been missing something over the years, and that the result of this failure for them to understand the importance of accountability and institutions was that despite all the efforts, despite the huge prowesses in improving productivity of agriculture, there were still as many, indeed more hungry people in 1996 than in the early 1980s. So that is where the right to food originated and how it was revived. Let me perhaps say a few words about what significance was given to the right to food in the early years before showing its added value and its effectiveness in today's discussions. The legal significance of the right to food can be described in different ways, and the first, I suppose, progress it allowed to make is in understanding the different components of what food security consists in. In the general comment number 12 of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, we have a definition of the right to food that includes these 4 elements, conveniently called the 4 A's, referring to food availability as one component or one condition for food security. There must be enough food in any particular region to feed the people. But that, whilst important and indispensable, is not enough. A second dimension is accessibility. It's important that all people have access to food, either by producing food themselves or by having access to employment, providing an income with which they can purchase food, or by social protection schemes that can be developed for them in case where they have no sufficient incomes from work, or if they are unable to seek employment. So in addition to availability, we have accessibility. We then have the third component, which is adequacy. The right to food is not simply about not starving from having insufficient calorie intake. It is also about having adequate diets that provide the adequate range of micronutrients and that provide the possibility for healthy and active lives thanks to diversified diets. And this is a dimension, the question of adequacy, which is often underestimated by many who see food as essentially a question of increasing the yields of basic cereals in the Green Revolution-like approach. And then fourthly, we have a dimension of absorption, utilization. The right to food is also about health care. It's about adequate feeding practices, and it therefore is not simply about which foods we absorb and which is our calorie intake. Beyond this, however, the right to food was described based on the work by this Norwegian jurist, Asbjørn Eider, as imposing precise obligations on governments. And Asbjørn Eider, in the mid-1980s, as a member of the United Nations Subcommission on Human Rights, developed the idea that economic and social rights impose on governments essentially 3 levels of obligations. First, governments had a duty to respect existing levels of enjoyment of social and economic rights. They should not interfere, for example, with the right to food by destroying crops or by evicting farmers from the land that they use. This obligation to respect is the first obligation imposed on governments. The second obligation is an obligation to protect the right to food and other social and economic rights when it is threatened by the conduct of private actors. For example, traders who hoard food speculating on higher prices. Or, for example, employers not paying the minimum wage to their workers, thus not allowing them to purchase food from the market. Or private groups interrupting the flow of food aid in order to penalize a population. All these interventions by private actors call for the governments to intervene to ensure that all people have access to food, and governments should use regulatory tools at their disposal to ensure the right to food remains guaranteed at all times. Thirdly and finally, and most problematically, governments have an obligation to fulfill the right to food. So beyond the obligation to respect and to protect, they must adopt policies that progressively realize the right to food and move towards a system in which all have access to adequate food of sufficient quantity and quality. And that is, of course, the most delicate obligation, the duty to fulfill. It is an obligation to create conditions that allow the food systems to deliver for the benefit of populations the kind of food that we need. And it is a requirement that governments put in place policies that may only be successful in the long term, that must be realized over time and require investments, efforts, multi-year strategies to be successful. The duty to fulfill is a duty to support agricultural development, to establish social protection schemes, to be prepared against natural calamities, to implement policies that move towards the full realization of the right to food. And the reason why this level of obligation is delicate is because whilst courts can protect existing entitlements and parliaments adopt laws to control private actors when by their conduct these private actors may violate the right to food, it is much more difficult to discharge this third obligation to fulfill, to progressively realize the right to food. Courts are often powerless to order long-term strategies to be implemented. Parliaments often are not well equipped to do this, in part because the time horizon of parliamentarians is shorter than what would be required for successful strategies to be implemented. So we need something else, and this is probably the third and major contribution of the right to food to debates on food security. Because the right to food is also a governance tool that allows us to address this question of long-term strategies and action plans to move towards the full realization of this right. As a governance tool for the progressive realization of the right to food, the right to food means a duty imposed on governments to adopt action plans that essentially shall allow governments to be held accountable in the long run for implementing the promises that they make to their populations. Very clearly, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights recommends and expects from governments that they put in place strategies, action plans that define very clearly a timeline for taking measures that will progressively realize the right to food based on an understanding of the obstacles that people face in enjoying the right to food, by listening to what these people have to say and having them participate in shaping these strategies. What such strategies should achieve are essentially five things. Firstly, these strategies should allow a better coordination between different ministerial departments, between different branches of government that must be working together to move towards sustainable food systems and to the full realization of the right to food. Let me take one example, school feeding programs. School feeding programs are most successful when they not only provide food to pupils in schools and thus an incentive for parents to send their kids to school. That is, of course, their immediate objective. But the multiplier effects we can hope from school feeding programs will be maximized if governments also source from local farmers and thus provide access to markets and incomes for these local farmers. And if the school meals that are prepared in schools in these school feeding programs, for example, are part of public works programs, providing employment to women and thus a source of income for women, rural women in particular, whose bargaining position within the household can benefit with important benefits for the nutritional and health outcomes for the household as a whole. So these school feeding programs, thus conceived, should in principle require not only that the Department of Education takes an initiative, but it also requires that the Department of Agriculture supports small-scale farmers to be able to take part. It requires that the Department of Employment, Social Affairs, with its public work programs, contributes to these efforts. And this kind of program requires a coordinated approach by different agencies of the government, different ministerial departments. Just one example to illustrate this. One of the most successful examples we have of these approaches that try to move towards the right to food by maximizing synergies is the one provided by the city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil. In 1993, when Pedro Sananias, the mayor of Belo Horizonte, on the right of the slide, was elected, he found a city of 2.5 million people where the poverty rate was about 11% and where 20% of the children were hungry. And what he found was that although there was immense poverty and undernourishment in the city, there was also huge poverty amongst local farmers just around the city of Belo Horizonte. Why? Because the local food system had been essentially destroyed, dismantled. The local farmers had no access to markets, and the poor consumers in Belo Horizonte were not supported in having access to the locally produced nutritious foods that, if their purchasing power had been better, they would have been able to buy and to afford. And so he launched a series of programs in Belo Horizonte that tried to rebuild the connections between the local producers and the poor consumers in Belo Horizonte, including school feeding programs, but also community kitchens and farmers markets that re-established this local food system that for many years had been neglected by the public authorities. The results were spectacular. Pedro Sananias then became the Minister for Social Development in the government of Lula da Silva in 2003. And in part, the Belo Horizonte program was the paradigm that led the Fome Zero strategy, the Hunger Zero strategy in Brazil under the Lula presidency. A second benefit of these strategies is that they should plan for an adequate mobilization of funds going to programs that seek to improve food security, ensuring that these funds will be earmarked for this purpose and that there will not be these funds hostage to short-term electoral politics. Thirdly, these strategies should promote public debate and participation by the population in identifying the priorities, identifying the obstacles to the right to food and how to remove these obstacles or circumvent them. Fourthly, these strategies should ensure that a strong signal shall be sent by the government that reducing food insecurity is a priority that all governmental agencies should keep in mind in making their choices in the various areas that can have an impact on the right to food. And finally, but very importantly, these strategies are a way to avoid us becoming hostage to the short term and instead keeping in mind the long-term objectives that the strategy entails. In my work in developing countries, I found that in many cases, governments were acting sometimes with very good intentions, but in many ways not paying sufficient attention to the long-term impacts of the decisions they have to make under the pressure of emergency. For example, when the prices go up, they reduce import tariffs in order to allow the populations in urban centers to have access to affordable food. And that is, in the short term, an obviously good thing to do, right? It can, alleviate fears of the urban population that they will not be able to have access to food at affordable prices. But in the long term, it means increasing a dependency on food imports, creating ever more disincentives for local producers to invest in production, increasing the speed at which rural to urban migration shall proceed, and it shall, in the long term, reduce the chances of these countries to build their independency from international markets. And so what can we do to reduce this situation in which the short term dictates policies and the long term is heavily discounted? Well, long term multi-year strategies are a way to achieve this. These national strategies that are the governance tool that governments should adopt in order to realize the right to food in a multi-year phased fashion are especially effective when they are grounded in framework laws. What are framework laws? Framework laws are legislation that establish a structure, an institutional structure, under which these strategies shall be designed, the targets defined, the accountability mechanisms set up, participation of civil society organizations and farmers' organizations made possible, and a dialogue encouraged between the government and non-state actors to shape the strategy and ensure that it is effectively implemented. Giving this legislative framework to build national food strategies upon ensures that these strategies shall indeed be adopted. It's a legal requirement, and that the rights to participate, to shape these strategies, shall be granted to civil society organizations, farmers' organizations, and will not be denied to them by governments intent on technocratic solutions rather than participatory approaches. So that is what the right to food tries to achieve. The shaping of adequate institutions to ensure that governments deliver on the promises they make and are serious about combating food insecurity. Let me take again the example of Brazil. Brazil adopted in 2006 a national food and, well, a law that establishes a national food and nutritional security system. This is known as the CISAN law in Brazil, and it establishes exactly the kind of institutional framework I was referring to, on the basis of which a national strategy can develop. This 2006 law establishes a council called CONSEA, the National Council on Food and Nutritional Security. It's made up of 2/3 of members that are representing civil society organizations, NGOs, farmers' organizations. 1/3 of the members are governmental delegates from different departments of the government. And CONSEA, this council, provides recommendations to the Interministerial Chamber on Food and Nutrition Security. This is an interministerial task force that is responsible for receiving these recommendations and translating these recommendations into action plans, policies that are then implemented and assessed by CONSEA, which then makes, again, its recommendations to CAIXAN in a process that is iterative and allows for permanent learning and improvement of the policies that are being developed. That is, in part, why Fome Zero, the food program of Lula's government between 2003 and 2010 was so successful. It is because of this institutional framework and the participatory dimension that it includes. This monitoring and this evaluation of the effectiveness of policies shall be relying on indicators. Indicators that, as some of you may know if you work in the area of human rights, concern 3 different dimensions. Indicators can be measuring the legislative and policy framework. If you wish, the rights on paper as they are guaranteed by laws and regulations and policies. Indicators may measure how much efforts are being put into the programs, how much is spent, for example, on social protection, on school feeding, on investing in small-scale agriculture. And we may use an indicator to measure whether the government is delivering on its promises in this regard. But then we have also outcome indicators. We measure not only what exists on paper, not only the expenditures that are made and the policies that are implemented, we measure whether they are successful, whether we are making progress in reducing hunger and malnutrition. And because we have these outcome indicators that are combined with process and structural indicators, we have the tools we need to permanently improve on the policies once they have been decided in a learning process that combines learning with monitoring, a permanent revisability of policies in the light of whether or not they are successful. This is the framework that the Right to Food recommends and the tools that it has encouraged governments to adopt. What are the implications and how is this used? Well, Tim Wise very generously referred to some of the topics I've been studying in my mandate since 2008. I have to say that the single most encouraging development I have seen is in the emergence of a right to food movement in all regions, based in part on these recommendations that I've tried to describe. This has happened at domestic level. It has happened in the work of development cooperation agencies, and it has happened at global level. At domestic level, we have increasingly institutions that use the right to food to hold governments accountable and to oblige them to deliver on the promises that they make. One remarkable example is the role of the Indian Supreme Court since 2001. In 2001, some activists, having grown impatient with the fact that in the state of Rajasthan there were food stocks available that were not released by the government despite people growing hungry, sought advice from lawyers, and they teamed with the Human Rights Law Network of Colin Gonsalves to file a brief with the Indian Supreme Court obliging the state of Rajasthan to release its food stocks in order to reduce the spiraling prices and to provide food to the hungry. And the Indian Supreme Court actually not just welcomed this petition of these NGOs, led by the People's Union for Civil Liberties, it also entered into a long-term involvement in the various social programs that the Indian states have in place to reduce food insecurity. This is an ongoing case. It's been developing since more than 10 years now, and it led the Indian Supreme Court to define as legal entitlements that people have a right to and that they can claim a range of 8 social programs that previously were conceived as purely charity-based. For example, midday meal schemes that provide lunches to school children were previously delivered by governments without this being a legal entitlement for the children of their families. Public works programs, the integrated child development services, a very important social program in India, were defined as a constitutional requirement that governments should guarantee to the population. The Indian Supreme Court also ordered that these programs be universalized, that they benefit all children in all states instead of being reserved to some and depending on the goodwill of the local governments in place. And the implementation of these judicial orders was facilitated by the mobilization of NGOs. The Right to Food campaign is the umbrella network of NGOs working on the case, and they help the Supreme Court monitor its own decisions. The Supreme Court has established 2 commissioners of the court that examine, monitor whether governments are actually complying with these judicial orders. And this is in one of the poorest states of India, Bihar, one commissioner of the court working with a representative of this NGO, the People's Union for Civil Liberties, to examine whether the midday school meal scheme is indeed complied with, looking at the list of recipients and how the funds are being used by the local schools. That is one example, but we have many other examples of social programs that seek to support agricultural producers that either have been improved significantly by being defined as legal entitlements or could be improved significantly if we were to treat them thus. For example, in a recent study, 2 researchers from Wageningen University and the World Bank, respectively, Li Pei and Le Christiansen, have documented how inputs were provided to farmers in Tanzania in the region of Kilimanjaro. And their article documents very clearly that the very good-looking input subsidies program of the Tanzanian government that was decentralized in that the local communities decided who received the inputs, this program was actually captured by the local elites, and the men in particular amongst the elites, simply because these were not entitlements for the small-scale producers. They were just given away as if this were simply government-subsidized charity by the local elites. So there's a great risk of discrimination, of capture by elites, of unequitable distribution of benefits if they are not inscribed into legislation. I'm now finalizing a report on the situation of rural women and how they are victims of discrimination. And I find, unsurprisingly perhaps, that because of various mechanisms through which women are being discriminated against, they are not at all supported as all other food producers in the programs that are not gender sensitive. And it is one reason, one supplementary reason why grounding these programs into the right to food, describing them and treating them as legal entitlements people have a right to, can benefit women and improve the effectiveness of these programs as a result. There are other developments which I would like to briefly mention. The most remarkable progress has been made in this area in Latin America, and that was the result of a number of factors. First of all, the political leadership of Brazil and Guatemala in encouraging many Latin American countries to adopt framework laws on the right to food, to adopt national strategies on the right to food. And not only did Brazil and Guatemala encourage countries in the region to adopt these different strategies and laws, they also were supported by the FAO and the Spanish government under a program that is called the Latin American and Caribbean Initiative Without Hunger. This work was also supported by a network of parliamentarians who established a parliamentary front against hunger and who worked together, exchanging good practices to pressure governments to deliver on their promises and to make progress in implementing these laws and these national strategies. This is a table which I have no time to develop, but it shows in all these countries of Latin America how progress is being made on this front. I had more recently various consultations in Africa, and there too we see in various parts of Africa how governments are moving towards the right to food. Laws are being adopted that define which rights the population has to benefit from certain types of support, social programs, inputs, technical advice for farmers. We have national strategies adopted by governments that are independently monitored for their results and that are developed in a participatory way. We have national human rights institutions who hold governments accountable so that they are to deliver on these programs and target the most vulnerable in the way these programs are shaped. And again, I have no time to go through this, but in the consultation I had in Nairobi this past April, I could bring together parliamentarians, NGOs, farmers' organizations, national human rights commissions to build a network of English-speaking countries of Eastern and Southern Africa, all of which are witnessing very remarkable developments in this regard, leading to a right-to-food movement emerging in this part of Africa. And I'm now working on French-speaking and Portuguese-speaking regions in Africa, where very much the same developments are being witnessed and occurring. There is, of course, a sort of dialectical relationship between these institutional developments on the one hand and the strengthening of farmers' organizations, farmers' unions, and civil society groups on the other hand. The more you create opportunities for participation in public decision-making, the more these farmers and poor will have an incentive to organize better and to become active participants in the way these policies are being shaped. And the more these social movements are strengthened along the way, the more they can build pressure with parliamentarians to oblige governments to adopt these frameworks allowing for consultation, for participation, and ultimately for the strengthening of the institutional dimensions of the right to food. Development cooperation agencies are increasingly seeing the benefits of using the right to food in the way they develop their programs. And for the sake of time, I shall not discuss this in any detail. I welcome questions on this if you have an interest in this being developed. But let me simply say this in 2 sentences. There's been, over the past 10 years, an increasingly polarized debate in this area between 2 polar opposite views, to simplify. One is the view that, if you wish, big pushes for agricultural development and poverty reduction strategies should create the conditions to allow developing countries to climb out of the poverty trap in which they are caught. And that is, of course, the approach that Jeffrey Sachs, in his quite remarkable book, The End of Poverty of 2005, is putting forward. And then you have the opposite view that actually these technocratically driven big plans are worthless, that what we need to do is let the market forces develop and play their miracles by providing the right incentive sets for the private sector in particular to invest where it matters, and for the people to build up initiatives from the bottom up. And that is, of course, the perspective of the primary contradictor of Jeffrey Sachs, Bill Easterly, in a book of 2001, The Elusive Quest for Growth, and perhaps even more so in The White Man's Burden, a book he published a few years later. Now, this idea that, on the one hand, you have the technocrats pushing for plans imposed from above, and the friends of the market who believe that things should move from the bottom up and we have to create the right incentives for the markets to play out its miracles. This is, of course, an oversimplifying opposition. And I believe that the right to food provides an avenue that is equivalent to neither of these approaches. I do believe that the approach of Jeffrey Sachs is insufficiently attentive to the benefits of participation, accountability, and empowerment, which I think are key for plans not to be purely technocratic driven, but to be inspired by the knowledge of the real experts of what it is to be poor, which are the poor themselves. I also think that the market has not always been including those with the weakest purchasing power, and that we need to ensure that the strategies that are developed will be reducing inequalities, empowering the poor, rather than letting it to market forces. And so I believe the right to food can allow us to shape policies in the area of development cooperation in a way that is more effective in reducing poverty. I accept I've not said enough to convince you, but I'm happy to take questions to provide more details on this. What I would like to, however, mention is the last implication of the right to food, which is on global governance. And here, I would like to basically describe in a few words the equivalent at global level of what I have sketched is happening at the domestic level with the reform of the Committee on World Food Security in Rome. Now, this committee is not new. It's been around since the first World Food Conference of 1974, but this intergovernmental committee of the FAO was largely dormant for many years, for 25 years. It was ignored, it was irrelevant, it was a talk shop, and not even an interesting one at that. The global food price crisis of 2008 led many governments and international agencies to realize that one key part of the problem, explaining our inability to really tackle global hunger, was a lack of consistency between different sectoral approaches. Approaches in the area of trade, development cooperation, food aid, climate change, energy policies, and indeed agricultural policies were not converging. And the example Tim Wise was referring to a few minutes ago when he mentioned the work the GDAE Institute did on biofuels is one such example. Biofuels policies were shaped and implemented completely apart from their implications for food security concerns. And the same is true, even more obviously so, for trade policies, which were developed with many aims in view, except reducing food insecurity for the poorest, who will be negatively impacted by trade liberalization. And so the realization was we needed to have more policy convergence. We needed to have all these policies addressed together, better coordinated, made more consistent for the sake of improved food security. And the Committee on World Food Security was seen as having to fulfill this function. It was therefore revised, reformed, with also the view that the voice of the poorest, of small-scale producers, of women, was vital for governments to understand what they could do to effectively tackle global hunger. And so we have in this forum not just governments who are the members, but also participants who are small-scale food producers organizations, including the Via Campesina. You have philanthropic foundations, you have the private sector, you have various international agencies working on food security in the broad sense of the word, including the World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods institutions. And all these work together to identify, based on the rule of consensus, solutions that governments should seek inspiration from, or recommendations that governments should seek inspiration from in moving towards reducing global hunger and malnutrition. It is quite remarkable that this forum, which is very inclusive, and therefore where it's very difficult, because of the widely divergent interests represented in this room, very difficult to mobilize and to arrive at decisions. It is quite remarkable that this revised Committee on World Food Security has managed to not just survive, but to prove it could be effective in adopting recommendations addressed to governments and agreeing on some major texts, such as in May of this year, guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests, to have governments manage the land and natural resources in ways that are more poverty-reducing and attentive to the situation of the most marginal, depending on natural resources. So this Committee on World Food Security is a very interesting body, and in his recent work, Tim Wise with Sophia Murphy have been showing that there's actually a competition between this Committee on World Food Security, as I've just described it, and other instances who would like to shape the international agenda in the area of food security, the G20 being the most important of these competing instances. But the Committee on World Food Security is really the most inclusive. It is there that long-term strategies are beginning to be developed. It is there that participation is ensured. It is there that accountability is now being built. And it is replicating at global level what I've tried to describe is happening at domestic level. So let me close by saying that, as some of you would know if you follow these debates and my modest contribution to these debates, I see the priorities today as having to effectuate essentially two transitions. One is a transition towards relocalized food systems and better connections between countryside, the local small-scale food producers, and the urban populations. I think we've undermined and neglected local food systems for too many years now, and that is one major reason why we've not invested in the type of agriculture that can be most poverty-reducing. So the first transition we must make is towards more relocalization of the food systems. And the second transition we must make is towards more sustainable modes of consumption and production. And I've been an advocate of agroecological methods of food production, in particular in this regard. Such transitions towards sustainable food systems, sustainable economically, sustainable socially by the spread of incomes they will result in, sustainable ecologically by the environmental impacts they shall have, such transitions are very difficult to achieve. They are difficult to achieve because they do not correspond to the short-term interests of governments, and they run counter to the vested interests of those in power. And we will only manage to achieve these transitions if we give ourselves governance tools, institutions that oblige us to move in these directions that experts agree are desirable in principle. And it seems to me that four implications follow. First, we need to place more emphasis on accountability. Governments must be held to account. We must measure the effectiveness of the policies they put in place. We must examine whether the policies that they implement are effective in reducing hunger and malnutrition, and if they are not, we must revise these policies. Second, we must ensure that the weakest, the most disempowered and marginalized take part in shaping the answers, in identifying the solutions. You know, we will never succeed in reducing poverty without listening to the poor. In many cases, they know exactly what is needed. Simply by listening to them, we will identify the low-hanging fruits, the easy-to-apply solutions that they need most to overcome the obstacles that they face and know all about. And often their wisdom is greatest than those of the experts who provide recommendations to governments. We need these experts, however, who have data, who can provide cross-country comparisons, and who can enrich the debates by their findings, but we must include participation in our governance systems. Thirdly, we need multi-year strategies. And we need to do this to have these multi-year approaches to avoid, again, discounting too much the long term and allowing a transition to take place by national strategies at the domestic level and by action plans adopted at the global level. And indeed, the Committee on World Food Security at its most recent 39th session in Rome just a month ago, at which Tim and I were both present, the Committee on World Food Security adopted a global strategic framework for food and security and nutrition that is a sort of global action plan for the international community. It's not precise in deadlines, it's not precise in quantified targets to achieve, but it provides a roadmap for action that governments are encouraged to seek inspiration from. So we are moving towards this, in which the long term matters as much as the short term in how policies are designed. And finally, we need a complementarity between national efforts and the international environment. I think governments will never succeed in their food security strategies if they are not supported by an enabling international environment, for example, a trade system, development cooperation, a system of food aid that is not disrupting local markets and instead is based on local regional purchasing, empowering the local farmers and incentivizing to produce more and better. All this must be managed in order for local efforts, national efforts to be successful. And this complementarity between national efforts and international efforts is again what we are moving towards. So you see, this is the first time I'm actually speaking of the right to food. I usually discuss issues such as rural development, sustainable agriculture, trade issues, and I tend to not want to discuss governance institutional issues that are often seen by policymakers as relatively soft issues, luxury items of symbolic value at best. I have come to believe, however, that this is an absolutely vital component for our food security strategies to be successful. And I'm delighted now to take your questions and receive your critiques. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier. We have about 20 minutes for questions. I'm going to let Olivier take his own. So please raise your hands. I believe Aaron, we do need to use the mic to, so wait till you get a mic to you to ask your question. And try to keep your questions relatively short, because that way we'll have time for more of them.
Okay, we can start from one of the questions from some of our online viewers. The question is, your comment that more support for farmers' organizations seems to be very important, but it is in those countries that choose to neglect small-scale agriculture that farmers' organizations are the weakest, so the governments in such countries are unlikely to support increased farmer mobilization anytime soon. Given this, what else do you think should be done to support farmers' organizations?
I propose to take some questions in a row for time management purposes. I think it will work best. Thank you, Elise.
Thank you. I guess really appreciated the presentation. And this is a question that seeks to be provocative. When I hear some of the principles around the right to food, availability, accessibility, adequacy, absorption, and using the market, I could imagine a world where the role of government is to help Walmart become more global and subsidize them going the last mile to reach the last billion people with corporate agriculture that's affordable and accessible to the rural poor. Why isn't that view of the future a view that could be included as in the right to food? it ties to the question about local food systems. Those countries, as a related matter, many of the countries you listed that adopted food sovereignty laws, Guatemala, Nicaragua, since they developed those laws, often the people are now, there's more hunger and more malnutrition. So where's the path forward?
Right. Thanks.
This is more of a request than a question. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the tension between the right to intellectual property and the right to food in the realization of food security.
I'll take one fourth question and then try to answer them. Is there a fourth one here in the front?
Thank you for a great talk. This has been a wonderful area to follow. And one turn you take that I find quite striking and a bit of a non sequitur is your last conclusion, the first bullet in the last conclusion, where you say, so clearly localism must follow. And that I don't understand. I fully understand why access to land, access to inputs, access to particularly gender rights, all the protections you talk about are essential for agriculture to be part of a right to food. But I don't understand why you would want to deprive people of imported food, for example. I don't understand why export restrictions by exporting countries wouldn't be at the top of your agenda, because they deprive importers of the right to food. Why does localism follow from the right to food?
Okay, so thanks for these questions, of course, all very important and relevant. Let me try to take them in order. First, farmers' organizations, yes, they have a major role to play, I think, in different ways. Three at least seem to me to be priorities. First, one major obstacle small-scale farmers face is that they are isolated and they are unable to produce as well as they could because of this isolation in which they find themselves. Organizing them better, and that's the first reason why we must do this, it will allow them to have a stronger bargaining position in the food systems and, for example, negotiate for fair prices for the inputs that they may wish to use and better prices for the crops that they sell on the markets. This is one of the professions, paradoxically, in which you buy at retail prices the inputs that you use, and you sell at wholesale prices the produce that you make and that you deliver. And we need to strengthen farmers, first of all, to allow them to capture a greater value of the end product that they deliver. Secondly, however, we need also to organize them better to allow them to be a political constituency that matters and to be recognized as valid participants in the shaping of public policies, to be interlocutors of the government that the government cannot avoid speaking to. And by giving them a voice in the political system, I believe that they can, per definition, allow these policies to be more responsive to their interests. And in many cases, they have been entirely silenced and neglected in many developing countries, in part as a result of them being illiterate, poor, and not mobilizing easily because spread over large areas without an ability to really demonstrate, manifest as urban populations may, urban populations on which governments depend in many cases for their stability. So I think that's the second reason why we have to organize farmers better. There is perhaps a third reason, which is that farming must become more and more knowledge intensive, and I hope less input intensive in the future. I think the direction of input-intensive agriculture is a dangerous one because of the volatile and increased prices of fossil energies and the increasing costs for farmers producing by using large amounts of external inputs in their farming. But they need to be trained to do something else, and this training, this exchange of knowledge, is best achieved in a horizontal way by farmers working together to basically learn faster from each other. And this is particularly important in the face of climate change and the need to develop climate resilient types of agriculture. So for all these reasons, I think farmers' organizations should be better supported. It's in the interest of the governments themselves to have someone with whom to interact, with whom to dialogue, to learn from, and to allow them to be more productive for rural development than to be strengthened. Now, there was a question of Willie Masters at the end, which I'd like to link to your question, sir, on corporate agriculture. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. But these questions are linked in the sense that your first question, at least, was about corporate agriculture. And your question, Willie, was about local food systems and why they're necessary. My answer is the following. For many years, we have been accepting food systems to develop in ways that were increasingly and sometimes exclusively investing in export-led agriculture, in large-scale agro-industrial types of agriculture. And the result of this has been, first of all, that poverty in rural areas in developing countries has increased because many of the rural poor who depend on small-scale family agriculture were simply not benefiting from any kind of support by the government. Those who were supported amongst the agricultural producers were the middle-sized or large-sized agricultural producers who were producing for large markets, who were therefore taxable. The government could collect money by taxing these larger producers, who were able to export and thus to capture foreign currencies for their governments to be able to finance industrialization. And small farmers were not helped. The result of this has been, over the past 30 years, very rapid migration from the rural to the urban areas, cities becoming unable to cope with the increased number of slum dwellers that resulted from this. We have today 1.3 billion people living in slums in developing countries, and there's by far not enough employment created in the services and industry sectors to absorb all this excess workforce coming from the rural areas. So we need to support rural development, support small-scale farmers, thus reduce rural poverty, and slow down the migration to the cities, allowing, in the meantime, investments to go also to industry and services to create jobs in the cities for those who will continue to migrate. We have to do the two at the same time. And not only must we do the two at the same time, we also must realize that by investing in small-scale family agriculture in developing countries, we are not just supporting agriculture. We are also supporting the other sectors of the economy because of the important multiplier effects that increasing the incomes of the mass of rural poor shall have on local economies. And this is shown by many studies. The World Bank calls this agriculture-led industrial development, showing that if you increase the incomes of the large number of rural poor, you will create markets for local providers of services, local manufacturers of manufactured goods, and allow the other sectors also to benefit from these increased opportunities. There are important multiplier effects in that regard. For this reason, I believe we have to provide more chances and give more support to these small-scale family farmers. But it's not only for that. It's also that these small farmers, and this is shown by all cross-country studies I could examine, are more productive per hectare than large-scale agro-industrial plantations. This is not always well understood because, of course, we use a measure of efficiency that is often labor productivity. In other terms, we see large-scale agro-industrial mechanized plantations as highly efficient because they produce more per active laborer, which is true. And they are also, I might add, more competitive on large markets because they are good at producing for the low-cost food economy large volumes, large quantities for large markets. But small farms produce more per surface of land. Yes, they are labor intensive. Yes, if farmers were not self-exploiting themselves and accepting to work for very low rewards, they might disappear. But they make the best use of natural resources, particularly if you take into account all the various outputs from the small farm that often combine different crops on the same surface. So they are better at using natural resources. They are better at maintaining the ecosystems. They are better at providing nutritious diets to the local populations depending on them. And those of you at the Friedman Institute, Nutrition Institute School, working on the links between agriculture, food, and health will be well aware of the importance of small-scale family agriculture in providing nutritious, diversified diets to local populations that large-scale cereal plantations, producing wheat and maize and soybean cannot deliver in the same way. So for all these reasons, I am for not abandoning the dominant, agro-industrial mode of agriculture. We need both, in my view, a view that is not unanimously shared. But we certainly need to invest much more in small-scale family agriculture. I just think these are different worlds, serving different markets, responding to different needs, and fulfilling different functions. I do think that there are positive externalities from small-scale agriculture that are underestimated, and there are negative externalities from large-scale industrial mode, industrial agricultural production that are not internalized in the cost of food that we pay as end consumers. You were absolutely right, sir, to point at the gap between my over-enthusiastic description of the right to food making progress in various regions and the lack of results in some countries that are moving in this direction. So it is certainly not the magic bullet some would have hoped to find. It is the implementation of these strategies and framework laws is highly uneven from country to country. I was in South Africa a year ago for an official mission, and it's amazing the number of national strategies and action plans they have, none of which is actually translating into results on the ground. In fact, it's a disaster on the ground. But it is one springboard that civil society, that farmers' organizations should use to demand more from the government, to challenge the government, to require that agrarian reform, for example, I'm thinking now of South Africa, is indeed taken seriously rather than consisting in just distributing land without providing any support to those producers. So I believe it can help. I absolutely do not believe, nor do you, that it is sufficient and that everything will follow from adopting the right institutional frameworks. Intellectual property rights and the right to food. Look, it's where does this question come from? Right. So you're still there. I have to answer. Look, it's no. Otherwise, I would have said, well, too bad. I would have had so many interesting things to say. Let me say this. We have, for many years, we have had in the developing countries seed systems that have been effective in allowing farmers who had no access to credit, who had no possibility to borrow money because they had no land on which they had titles and so forth. These seed systems delivered well in allowing these farmers to exchange, to receive from their neighbors the seeds they needed to ensure adequate production. And in many cases, they were just reusing the seeds from the previous harvests. These seed systems still provide seeds to the vast majority of small-scale farmers in developing countries. In our rich countries, we have had, since the 1920s 20s and 30s, a separation developing between farming on the one hand and the development of seed varieties on the other hand, or plant varieties on the other hand. A specialized profession has emerged in the hands of seed companies who provide seeds to farmers, and farmers have nothing to worry about. They just pay a relatively small price each year to buy the seeds they need to invest. So we have two systems. And the two systems present each some advantages and some disadvantages. The commercial seed system in the hands of seed companies provide high-yielding varieties of seeds that can be highly productive under certain conditions for the farmers who can afford them and for the crops for which research is being invested, which is mostly the crops that in the Midwest and in industrialized countries in general, farmers like to develop, essentially as inputs for the food processing industry. Traditional seed systems, farmer seed systems, have other advantages. They preserve agrobiodiversity, they reward it, they are more affordable for farmers who have no access to cash, they are systems that are resilient in many cases to climate change because of the absence of genetic uniformity across plants, allowing by a simple portfolio effect to mitigate the risks of losses if you have new pests, diseases, or climate shocks arriving. And we do not know what the future shall be made of, so we need to preserve these farmer seed systems. And so in a report I wrote on that exact issues, I advocate for the coexistence of the two systems. I find, however, that in many developing countries, there is a strong pressure to marginalize the farmer seed systems and to develop commercial seed systems without many governments realizing that ultimately the commercial seed system is dependent on farmer seed systems in order to renew its stock of varieties and in order to be able to tap on this agrobiodiversity that is developed generation after generation by the farmers. So we need both for different farmers, for different purposes, and because they each have different functions to fulfill. That is the light in which intellectual property rights must be examined. They are useful to stimulate research by seed companies who want to be paid back for the investment in research they make. At the same time, they are sometimes a problem for farmers who would like to benefit from from these seeds developed by these seed companies. And whilst IP rights reward the seed companies on the one hand, I see that the small farmers developing farmer seed systems are not rewarded enough. There are some attempts to do this, but I think the balance should be reestablished in their favor. Right? So this is what the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture seeks to achieve by having a fund established to support farmers contributing to agrobiodiversity. Let me pretend I've answered your questions. We have to stop? Okay, so well then, many thanks. You want to close?